Welcome back. All right, so bringing back something that I've done before. We're going to do it again here, and it is the quarter poll for some teams. There are a couple of teams that are past it, have already played 21 games. There are teams that have played as few as 17, and I figured this is as good a week as any to go ahead and grade teams and how they've done in the first quarter of the season. There's no scientific method I used for this. I kind of graded against what they were expected to be, where they were expected to be, and what the record was expected to look like. So that's the grade that I used for this. So if a team was expected to be great and they're playing great, cool. If a team was expected to be bad and they're playing really well, well, then that to me is a little more impressive. And then, of course, a little bit of a harsher grade for teams that were expected to be really good and might have had underwhelming results so far. We're going to start things off with Seattle, the only team that doesn't have a magnet that matches the others. And for Seattle, I'm going to go ahead and throw them as an A. Because for me, Seattle has been a surprise, and they've been quite good. And they're playing a different style of hockey. Very few scoring chances against. Not a lot of scoring chances for either. But they're playing what I refer to as the updated version. The new version of trap hockey, which is defense first, offense second. There are other teams that are doing it as well. It's not the same as the old neutral zone trap. But it does its best to make sure that you're keeping that playing field even. You're making sure that score stays even. Nobody's getting too far away from you in terms of score. You probably aren't building up a huge lead either, but that's the idea, right? All right, so that's where I have Seattle. St. Louis, what week is it? What week is it? For St. Louis, the losing streaks would get a D. The winning streaks, though, would tell you a B. I'm going to put them in the middle because of the losing streak and the winning streaks and all that fun stuff. I'm going to give them a C. So their winning streak right now, 7 games, is great. The 8-game losing streak wasn't. Honestly, I'm gonna chicken out on this and throw them as a C at this point. That being said, 2 winning streaks and a losing streak, I don't know that I've ever seen that. I think this has to be the first time I've ever seen that in all my time watching hockey. For the Calgary Flames, it has not been a fantastic year for Calgary thus far, but, they get that win in Philly the other night. They did well enough against the 2 Florida teams. I know Tampa Bay beats them, but I thought they still had a decent game there. I'm going to give Calgary a C. Yep. I'm going to give Calgary a C on this. Really good start to the season. Really rough, look like winless streak in there. But overall, I'm going to give them a C. Montreal, I'll give them a solid B. They weren't expected to be where they're at, right? There have been some rough nights. There have been some lopsided losses. Their goal differential reflects that. But yeah, Montreal is still in the hunt. And I don't think any of us expected that. And here we are. So I will go ahead and say Montreal has done quite well for themselves. I'll give them a B. Columbus, not as much. Columbus, I'm going to go ahead and throw a D there. The thing with Columbus, of course, they were expected to be better this year. Adding Gaudreau, making changes to the team. Obviously, there are instances where you make those changes, and it takes a while for those changes to become a positive for the team. Not every addition of a player becomes a success right out of the gate. But for Columbus, this year has been mostly a disaster thus far. For a team that was supposed to be better, it hasn't happened. And I know there's a whole swath of injuries that have overcome this team, but still, the record where it is, it's not what was expected. And that record has been rough right out of the gate. Vancouver, also a D. The Vancouver Canucks last night showed. And I thought this was very accurate. A headline saying the Canucks aren't having problems scoring goals, it's winning. And it's true. Their offense is just fine. It is their ability to play with a lead that is in question. And people want to find this player or that player to blame. I've seen Demko blamed, Miller blamed, Stillman blamed, Myers blamed. It depends on the game. It depends on the day. The reality is this is a team effort. This is a team that has underachieved to this point, and so they get a D for their first quarter. For the Oilers, I kind of have to throw them in the C category. I'm not going to give them a D. They're still above 500. They're still winning enough games that they're still in the hunt for a playoff spot. They're still in the mix. But this isn't what they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be one of the better teams in the West, and it hasn't happened yet. So I'll throw Edmonton as a C. Tampa Bay, bit of a rough start for them. They've been better lately. I will give them a B. Of course, they lost last night against Boston, but there's really no shame in that. And they could have come back. They could have tied that. They could have. There's a lot of could haves and might haves in there. So I'll give them a B. They really have played quite well after what was a rough start by their standards. So, yeah, there you go. Speaking of B, Boston. I will throw Boston in as an A. I have to. They're 17-2 through 19 games. And I was looking it up, and Chicago had a 17-0-3 start to the 2012-2013 season. So Boston's in that region. Now, Chicago won that Stanley Cup. However, the asterisk to that is it was a 48-game season. And the 48-game season, I think it's a little easier for President's Trophy winners. And I don't say that to throw any shade at Chicago. It's just, it's not a full 82-game schedule. And I thought the momentum just carried them through the playoffs. So if it was a 48-game season, I'd feel pretty good about Boston's chances of winning a cup. But it's an 82-game schedule instead. And the more that they win and the more that they look like they're going to finish first overall, the more I think, oh, I know what happens when Boston wins the President's Trophy. I don't need to see how this whole thing comes to an end because I'm well aware. But at any rate, Boston at this stage in the season gets an A. San Jose. San Jose's a tough one. I think they've been better lately. They have absolutely been better lately. However, and again, this is measured by expectations on the season. So last night they get the win over Ottawa. I'm going to throw them at a C at this point for just their overall play in the quarter. They had a rough start to the season themselves. They've had some poor games. But yeah, overall, I can't really say that San Jose has a worse record than expected, like I would say of Columbus and Vancouver. So yeah, I'll give San Jose a C overall for their start to the season. Buffalo. Great 7-3 start. Would have had them as an A. I'm going to have to place them as a D based on the 8-game losing streak. And just, it feels like things have been getting worse for Buffalo rather than better. And we'll see if that continues, right? It's too bad because they had a really good start after having a really good finish to last season. But here we are. And so they're right next to Vancouver. They came into the league together. They're next to one another. Both teams have had a frustrating recent, decade. So there's that. But Buffalo ends up getting a D. Toronto. Toronto's hard to really grade. Here's the reason. 10 wins out of 20 games. So they win 50% of their games. But they've got 25 points in 20 games. So, right? So for Toronto, I think that outside of the rough loss against Anaheim and the one against LA as well, and San Jose. Outside of that California trip, I think they've been playing relatively well. I'm going to go out on a limb and give them a B. I was leaning towards a C if I'd had a C plus on the board, but I thought, nope. 4 grades, stick with 4 grades. That's it. I will give them a B. I'll bump them up rather than bumping them down. I think Toronto's still going to be a playoff team. I think that they still have some issues to deal with here and there. But yeah, the 25 points in 20 games, I can't argue that as a C because that's on pace for 102 points this year. And that's the nature of the beast when you're dealing with the overtime and shootout loss points. And I've talked about that before, but at this point, they're on pace for about 20 of them. And we can all have the debate at another time about how we feel about a team getting 20 points based on games they've actually lost in the standings. Winnipeg. Winnipeg has been really, really solid. Now, last night's result against Carolina became a little bit hairier than it should have. They had a 3-0 lead with 5 minutes left, and then they blew it. Carolina pulled the goaltender and scored 3 times. It's like Carolina has this switch they can turn on. Winnipeg does end up winning it in overtime. And so, yeah, I'm going to have Winnipeg at the top. I don't think any of us expected Winnipeg to be this good. I thought maybe they could bounce back and get into the playoffs, but yeah, the record they have right now is far better than anything I would have even thought for them. So, yeah, Winnipeg, solid A. For the Kings have a 4-game winning streak at home. They go out on the road. They lose games in Vancouver. They lose in Seattle as well. I'm going to give them a C at this point. Now, I did the video on LA. They have a very favorable schedule for themselves over the next 12 games. And I could see them winning as many as 10 of those 12 if they really apply themselves and find that consistency, both on the blue line and in net. But overall, the picture for LA is still a little bit murky. What works in their favor is the fact that being in the Pacific, we may very well see a mediocre team end up in the top 3. There's plenty of time for Edmonton and Calgary to turn things around and get their record in order. But at this point, it is Vegas, LA, Seattle that look like they could end up being the top 3, which I don't know that anybody would have predicted those 3. Anyways, Washington. Washington's a tough one. I have to put them as a D and acknowledge at the same time they're dealing with major injury problems. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky for me with this. I would love to give Washington the benefit of the doubt, but then I have to do that with Columbus as well. And then I have to do that with a bunch of other teams. And sometimes it's not how many injuries, it's the key injuries. So because of the results and the points at this stage, I have to throw Washington into the D pile. And it's just that's where we are right now. Washington, there's still enough time for them to turn it around, but it gets dicey, right? You have the American Thanksgiving deadline where over the last decade, 71.3% of teams that are above the playoff line in American Thanksgiving make the playoffs. So we'll see if that is the case with the Caps, if they end up proving that wrong, that they end up being one of those 29% that end up making, because it's not exactly 71%, it's like 71.3%. So anyways, if they end up being one of those teams that's outside the playoffs that end up going on a bit of a run and get back into it, but at this point, it just doesn't look very likely. Philadelphia, good start over their last 10. It's been a rough go of it. I'm going to give them a C overall. Carter Hart pulls them up to a C. John Tortorella getting them to block shots and play the physical game gets them to a C. I don't think we expected them in the playoffs. It doesn't look like they're going to reach the playoffs. But I can't say they've underperformed. I can't. They're right about where we would have expected them to be. All right, Detroit. Detroit has been so up and down this year. Trying to figure out from one game to the next what you're going to get. Like I did the video on LA today. Honestly, the next one I should do is Detroit. I'm going to give Detroit a C as well. Some games they look really good. They go out there and they score at will. And then there's other games that they just look kind of lost out there. So they do get those games where they get a lot of goals. And then there's the games where they allow a lot of goals. So right now with Detroit, it really is feast and famine, sometimes within days of one another, sometimes within 24 hours of one another. And we'll see if Detroit can figure it out. Because there's definitely an opening there in the East for a team to break through with teams like Washington underperforming, Buffalo, Columbus underperforming. There's definitely an opening there for somebody to break through and get a surprising playoff spot. And that could end up being Detroit. The New York Rangers. The New York Rangers to this stage in the season, it is hard to give them a failing grade. Like, there's a part of me saying they could be a D, which to me is a fail. So I know there's some out there watching saying, well, D's not a fail. It depends on the grading wherever you're at, but when I was growing up, D was a fail. You had E for, like, you're really failing. But, sort of think like over the legal limit to drive a car, and oh my gosh, you shouldn't even be able to look at a car right now, much less drive one. So, I didn't put the E up there because I thought, that's a little bit too far. But when it comes to the Rangers, it is hard to get a read on them too. They do underachieve at times, but I'll throw them as a C. I feel like I'm chickening out by not putting them as a D, but I don't know that the record's a lot worse than we expected to start the season. They're not winning as many as I think they might have hoped, but I'm gonna put them as a C at this point. All right, so New Jersey's an A. When did I ever think I'd see the day I said that? And I'm pretty sure that's never been a thing on this channel. The Devils, 13 wins in a row. Can't be anything other than an A. And again, they haven't played anybody. They've played 13 games and won all 13. It's just, it's insane. It's so weird. I understand the need to cut people down exists for a lot of people, but I find it weird in sports that a team can go on a huge winning streak and still they haven't beaten anybody. What are you talking about? They've beaten 13 teams, not 13 different teams, but they've won 13 in a row, which is very impressive because if it wasn't, we'd see it all the time, and we don't. I've seen the comments about, well, remember the year Columbus and Minnesota had the 16-game winning streaks? Yep, the channel was in existence then. It was crazy to watch. I think New Jersey's winning streak has been more impressive than either of those winning streaks. That's just me. New Jersey's playing some really solid hockey all around. I don't feel like luck is playing the part in any of this. At times, you'll see these really long losing streaks. Both Minnesota and Columbus, there were occasions where maybe they got lucky. And in the case of New Jersey, it's just really hard work and everybody's buying in, and it's a lot of fun to watch. Florida. Florida's been a disappointment to this point in the season. And I look at the loss against Columbus the other day. It is hard for me not to give Florida a D at this point. They could miss the playoffs. So I talked about Detroit and maybe getting a surprise playoff spot. It could be at the expense of a team like Florida. If they go from winning the President's Trophy to missing the playoffs, that is a huge fail, right? And it will immediately call into question hiring Paul Maurice, getting rid of Andrew Burnett. It will call that into question just so fast. I do think that question's being asked by some at this point. It has to be, right? Florida's definitely underperforming. Sometimes it takes a while for them to get used to a new coach. But how long is this going to take? We're a quarter of the way into the season, and they're still underperforming. So Florida's got some. There's a head scratcher with Florida there too, in that they're usually out shooting their opponent and out chancing them too, and they're just finding ways to lose. Ottawa, D. Yeah, failing grade for Ottawa. This was supposed to be a year they got better. I know the defense has been talked about since before the season started as that's their weakness. But we really believed that the goaltending would be better, the offense would be better, and the numbers so far, it really hasn't been that much better. I really should have stuck by the whole DeBrincat argument I made when he went to Ottawa, which is there's no guarantee he's going to get 40 goals not playing with Kane. You can't just automatically recreate that chemistry somewhere else. And I think that's part of it. You know, DeBrincat, I think, only has the 5 goals to this point. He's on pace for about 20, which is a good season, but it's not what they wanted, right? That's not what they wanted. Giroux has overperformed a little bit, but still, the team as a whole, it has been a problem, and so Ottawa ends up getting a D there. Chicago, I'm going to put them as a C. We had expected Chicago to be right about where they're at. So, you know, C is the guys who are maybe underperforming a little bit or right around where we expected. And for Chicago, I do think that's where we expect them to be. I expect the fall to continue for them, actually. Minnesota, it is hard to argue Minnesota above a D as well, and I feel like I'm being really harsh in my grading, which is interesting because the last time I did this, I seem to remember people saying I was being too generous in my grading. But for Minnesota, it's been a real setback this year. The other problem, and I'm glad I'm not the only one that saw it, I actually talked to Yvonne. My wife is a fan of the Minnesota Wild, and I even said, you know, their games are getting boring again. And she agreed with me. She said, I'm having a hard time sitting through a whole game. They're getting really hard to watch. So this is something that had been resolved with Kaprizov and with the excitement. But it feels like Minnesota's games have turned back into chess matches, and they're not fun to watch. And that goes against what worked for them last year. So I really think that if they encourage more offense and make the game a little more dynamic for themselves, I think they'll also get better results. Nashville. Nashville's really kind of all over the place. They've been sitting around 500. Of course, they had the hard time after they came back from Europe. But overall, I'm going to say for them, passing grade. I'll give them a C. No problem. There are a lot of C's on this board. I'm honestly mildly surprised. And again, maybe I'm just grading too difficult, right? But for Nashville, they've not been one of the better teams in the Central. The Central has a lot of mediocrity in it right now. And I think for Nashville, they're part of that. Last night's game against Arizona, that should have been I'm not going to say easy win because Arizona makes you really work for it. But yeah, they kind of got in their own way at times last night. And they end up getting the win, sure. But it was a lot more difficult than it probably should have been. Colorado. Overall for Colorado, I'm going to put them as a B. They've performed quite well. They had a bit of a slow start, but as I mentioned in videos prior, they had a slow start last year too, and look how that turned out for them. Not too shabby. So for Colorado, I honestly think they've done well enough for themselves. I think that the Avs are a team to keep an eye on because they could very well repeat as Stanley Cup champions. That is something we've seen recently, where Pittsburgh did it, Tampa did it, and maybe Colorado's the next one. Maybe this is how dynasties will work now. It'll be 2 in a row, and then there you go. You got your dynasty. But for Colorado, I do think that they're getting better now as it goes along. And last night's game against Dallas doesn't go anywhere near a shootout, if not for Ottinger being absolutely bonkers. Just such a good game from Ottinger. Otherwise, that one's done in regulation. Carolina's a tough one, but I'm going to give them a B as well. Carolina, my concern with them is simple. I talked about this in the recap last night. I'll talk about it a little bit here. This is a team that has so much offense and they're so gifted, and yet the style of game that they play, that defensive style of play, understanding that as part of Brind'Amour and who he is, I think it actually holds them back from winning more games. I think this is a team that if they played the kind of pond hockey that some teams in the NHL play, where it's 7-4, 8-5, I think Carolina could win so many games 8-5, 9-3, but they don't play that style of hockey. So while Svechnikov's got 12 goals, he may end up threatening 50. I think he could score more if they played a more open style. Again, I understand that's not in their DNA. They don't want to do that, but it's kind of a shame because Carolina can be so fun. Last night's game against Winnipeg, they score 3 with the goalie pulled, and it showed they can kind of score at will when they really put their heart into it. But there was the game against Minnesota before that where it just didn't work. And so, yeah, Carolina, a B overall, but there are still some concerns. The Vegas Golden Knights, well, they're an A. Vegas has to be an A. Now, I had expected them to be better this year than last year. Obviously, they don't have the injury problems they had last year. There was concerns before the season started about their goaltending, right? But they're 15-4-1. They are, through the first 20 games of the season, on pace for more than 60 wins. So this is a good team, that have 60 and 80 games. And then there's 2 more games after that. So that would mean at least 61 that would be their pace. And they've been excellent throughout. So while Boston and New Jersey are hogging the headlines, Vegas is right there with them. And Vegas, while they were expected to be better, they were expected to be a playoff team. Were they expected to be this much better? Probably not. The New York Islanders, I'm going to give them a B. Under Lane Lambert, I think there's more offense there. I think they're being encouraged to play a little bit of more of an up-tempo style than they did under Trotz. I've seen comments as well along the lines of, well, it's all the same systems. I don't know that it is. It just feels different watching an Islanders game now. Under Trotz, very often their games were always the fastest. There was very few whistles, very few penalties, very quick games. And now for the Islanders, it feels like there's a little more going on there, and they're still, they're winning their share of games. They're still, in a spot where they could make the playoffs. And I think Lane Lambert has changed things up a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. The Anaheim Ducks, even by the standards that we might have had going into this season for Anaheim, 0 regulation wins, 20 games into the season. Well, 19 games into the season for them. They're 5-13-1. But Anaheim was expected to be a little better than 0 regulation wins through the first 19 games, right? And so for Anaheim, again, they were expected to not be great, but this has been a disaster thus far. So, yeah, I have Anaheim with a failing grade as well. And I think if I was grading all these teams, Anaheim might be the most disappointing of them. Although they weren't expected to be in the playoffs, so probably not. But it does feel like this was supposed to be a year where things got a little bit better. Remember last year, they actually had a pretty good record through the first half of the season, and then it fell off after that. The trade deadline definitely helped to submarine it, but they weren't bad. Arizona's a tough call. I'm going to say this. They're moving into a new building, right? Mullet Arena. And it could be a huge distraction. They got a 14-game road trip going. Even though they are 6-9-2, I'm going to give them a B. They work really hard. They get points they're not supposed to get against teams they're not supposed to get those points against. They've managed to find in Michelli, here's another player that's come in kind of out of nowhere and looks like he fits in. And he's fine. Chikrin's just come back. They're going to trade him once they've shown that he's healthy. And honestly, Arizona's done a pretty darn good job. I really, honestly, I can't justify putting them as a C because even though their record is middling, They were expected to be really awful this year, and they're not. So, to me, Arizona gets a B on hard work alone. Pittsburgh, it's been an up and down start. It is hard for me to justify giving them an A or a B, but I can't give them a failing grade either. So I'm going to stick them on the C line at this point. I think the Pittsburgh's played well enough to still be in the mix for a playoff spot. So, yeah, they end up getting a C out of it. And then last but not least, Dallas. Dallas, it's an A. Dallas has done so well so far this year. Ottinger's been a huge part of that too. Robertson, Hintz, Jamie Benn, huge bounce back year for him. I had expected Dallas to fall this year. I figured Dallas was probably going to fall out of the playoffs, and I couldn't be happier to be wrong. Like this year's predictions I had before the season started, being as wrong as I've been so far, I couldn't be happier. It's great. I am so happy that this year's standings are working out the way they are. Sure, I wish Vancouver was in the mix too, but Dallas being in the running for top team in the division, even though it's going to end up going to Colorado, just act surprised. And Boston potentially being the top team in the league, which ends in heartache when they win a President's Trophy, but still, what incredible starts. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.